Hi, this is Tony Pipa, and welcome to another edition of Cities Leading in Sustainability on the Post-COVID Era. I'm here today with Chris Castro. Welcome, Chris. Chris is the Senior Advisor to Mayor Buddy Dyer in the City of Orlando and the Director of Sustainability. Florida at this time is experiencing its own surge in COVID-19, a great deal of continued uncertainty as the state reopens. But Chris, for this conversation, I wanted to start pre-COVID because in 2007, Mayor Dyer made a commitment for Orlando to be the greenest city in the nation. And you've been one of the leading cities also in the United States, using sustainable development and the sustainable development goals as a way of thinking about what social and environmental progress looks like. So give us a sense, what was Orlando's strategy, and what was the work that was going on even before the pandemic hit around sustainability, and how are you approaching that?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Tony, and the Brookings team for this opportunity. As you clearly mentioned, we've had pretty strong leadership in Orlando around realizing that in order for us to continue to grow as a globally competitive city that attracts the creative class and has a prosperous future, we needed to prioritize this notion around sustainability, and not just the notion around environmental sustainability, but really being intersectional about it, looking at social, environmental, and economic as the triple bottom line. Most people don't realize, but Orlando over the last few years has been the most visited city in America. Last year, we saw 75 million people come to our city, basically a small city coming every single day to Orlando to play. And in addition to those who are coming to play, Orlando has also been one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. About 1,000 to 1,500 people every week was moving to our city. We had some of the highest and fastest job creation numbers that we had seen, and showing this evolution as a top destination for millennials and young professionals. Sustainability certainly is a core part of that strategy. And for a long time, we have been working very comprehensively at looking at urban sustainability in a different light. One that looks at things like clean energy and green buildings, local food systems, zero waste strategies, natural systems and ecology, transportation, and much more. And so, just recently, USGBC and their Lead for Cities efforts has designated us as a LEED Gold city, one of the first in the country. And in addition, our involvement with the Sustainable Development Goals really started to come about in 2018 when we were updating our Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. And we made the declaration towards the VLR, the Voluntary Local Review, back in October of last year, and have really seen just this momentum building, not just at the city, but the county, at the Regional Planning Council, and our academic institutions who are really taking on this framework for sustainable development and trying to make it a core part of our efforts in Orlando.
Great, thanks. I forgot to remind our viewers that our chat is open, so that if you have comments or suggestions or questions, actually during the conversation, please get them into the chat so that I can work them into our conversation here. So that was a lot of ground to cover. And in fact, some of what you were saying, 75 million people coming to Orlando, fastest growing city in the US, seeing some of the fastest job creation, and the focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, actually undertaking a voluntary local review, committing to one, and the work that you were doing on green energy, food systems, things like that. Then COVID hits, right?
Right.
The pandemic hits. So what's been the city's response? How did the city respond? And just take us a little bit through the trajectory of what's even happened at City Hall as you've been on the front lines with COVID.
Yeah, first of all, I think one thing that sets Orlando apart is this culture of collaboration and partnership. And it's often flexed and best realized during these times of crisis, whether it's a major hurricane event like Irma and Maria, just, most recently, or if it's something like a terror attack at the Pulse nightclub. These are events that we have really realized Orlando's strength in collective action. Our mayor, Buddy Dyer, and the county's mayor, Jerry Demings, have been really doing a fantastic job, in my opinion, at trying to address an unprecedented uncertainty of COVID-19. We had, the county oversees the health department systems throughout the state. So the city doesn't necessarily have a health department. It's really ran by the county. And so the county government has been controlling kind of the response for COVID within our region. And we've very much collaborated, with them. I'd say also a lot of other institutions have stepped up. The Orlando Economic Partnership, United Way, and our Second Harvest Food Bank, as well as our utilities and transit authority, who have all really stepped up in a really unique way. OUC, the electric utility, has given over $12 million thus far, just in the first 4 months of this pandemic, to lowering fuel rates for businesses and residents to make sure that the financial hardship is burdened less. They're suspended disconnects up until recently, and continue to provide funding for those families who are witnessing uncertainty, or who've lost their jobs, or are in some type of crisis themselves. So there's been a lot of this collaboration. Very early on in mid-March, we were one of the first cities, especially in the Southeast, to commit to that stay at home, stay healthy order, really focused on getting people to shelter in place. And what was interesting is our IT department really had a lot of the tools that we needed to maintain the city operations in some type of crisis like this. We use Office 365, and immediately, we moved to remote work. And I've been impressed at our ability to not only continue status quo, but pick up productivity in certain situations during this time. But all that said, even during the COVID, response, we've continued to prioritize sustainable development and the work that we had been doing pre-COVID. In fact, Mayor and our CAO, Kevin Edmonds, have said, we need to double down on our green economic development efforts and what we're doing with sustainability, especially now during COVID.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So what does that mean to double down in a era of uncertainty like this? I'm assuming that COVID has affected, obviously, the visits to Orlando that that were helping driving you economically. It's probably taken a hit also on the job creation that you talked about that was happening pre-COVID. And yet, you're doubling down on this agenda of sustainable development. So talk a little bit about what that means, and even how your agenda around sustainable development intersects with COVID and the response that you've had to COVID.
Yeah, I mean, as you've mentioned, Disney and Universal and SeaWorld, these are the major tourism engines for Orlando's region, and a big reason why we see the numbers of people coming here. And, before COVID, I thought it was staggering that Disney had only closed doors for a 24-hour period, had only closed doors 7 times since they opened in Orlando. 7 times total. That was through hurricanes, through storms, through other situations. And you can imagine they've been down for 3 months. This is obviously unprecedented, and we're in uncharted waters. That certainly has hit the numbers of tourists, the amount of economic output. But, Orlando is not the only city that's realizing that. In fact, every city in the country is realizing this economic uncertainty and hardship. And I think that's what makes this particular situation different than I think if it was just an Orlando crisis, if it was just a stress or a shock that hit our city. So in terms of this approach around sustainable development, before COVID, we had been working on about a dozen strategies, policies, and programs that really was trying to address the climate crisis and work on decarbonizing our energy supply, both on the electric and the transportation side. And when you start to look at COVID, this is a respiratory disease down to its core. And those that have been subject to poor air quality, or some of the injustices that we often talk about, the environmental justice movement, those that have been subject to that type of pollution are being disproportionately impacted by this situation. because it's essentially uncovering or spotlighting the underlying inequities that have been found throughout our communities, oftentimes that have been kind of disregarded or brushed under the rug, not realizing that, when a global pandemic hit, it would uncover those unlike ever before. And I think that that's a big reason why Mayor and our city leadership realized that we need to continue to move in that direction, even at a faster pace. We have to start to work on, transitioning our bus system to minimize its pollution output and move towards electric. And I'm happy to say that the first fleet of electric buses will land this fall in Orlando and begin this journey of electrifying the bus system over the course of the next 10 years. We're also working very closely with our utility, Orlando Utilities Commission, on moving away from traditional coal and natural gas power plants, which are still powering the majority of this country and the majority of Orlando, and quickly decarbonize and move them towards cleaner sources of energy. Of course, being in the Sunshine State, solar is a prevalent resource and an abundant resource that we want to tap into. And so even during COVID, just last week, Orlando brought on another 108 megawatts worth of solar. That's more than an 800% increase in the amount of solar power on our electric grid. There's another 150 in the pipeline. And so we're realizing that the strategies also that are helping to clean up the air and therefore improve public health are also some of the greatest economic development and job creation strategies that we have today in the market, even pre-COVID. The last 3 years in Florida, a solar panel installer has been the fastest growing job in the state, not only Florida, but 12 other states across the country. And we're also seeing tremendous amounts of economic investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars that are putting people to work here locally, jobs that cannot be outsourced to another state or another country, and that are really helping to revitalize a local economy. And as we look towards the response of COVID, I think it's important that we start to look at doubling down on that green economy. I was really encouraged to hear yesterday, Vice President Biden and candidate for president coming up, having a very strong $2 trillion climate infrastructure bill to get us out of this economic, depression that we're in. That shows that it's not just something that local governments are thinking about, but when you look back to the Recovery Act, those efforts that invested in local energy efficiency and conservation programs through the EECBG block grant were some of the greatest economic and job creation drivers that rebounded our economy in a pretty short amount of time. And when you look at how we can do that, address the climate crisis and solve this economic and public health crisis, that intersection really revolves around sustainable development. And I think that's why we're seeing our leaders double down.
So I want to come back to the job creation and also link it to the growing consciousness around racial equity and Black and brown people being left behind. But before I do that, since we're just talking about the sort of the continuation of your sustainable development agenda, which is impressive, talk a little bit about the VLR. And I want to also integrate a question around the VLR from the audience as well. So you were underway, you had committed to, and I know that it even started to doing a voluntary local review about your work and how it aligned up with the Sustainable Development Goals. How has COVID affected that? And how also have you engaged the private sector and other stakeholders in the city? How are you thinking about that as you undertake your VLR as well?
Yep. So I mentioned the update to our sustainability and climate plan in 2018. That's called the Community Action Plan. And in that effort, I wanted to begin the process of incorporating the global goals into our local priorities. And we held over 16 different community forums, online webinars, surveys, and the like. And in each one of those, the SDGs were front and center in terms of educating the public about them and showing the intersections between, the global framework and what our local framework was. And so that was the first step at making this linkage. We looked at our indicators, we did a matching exercise, we looked at our own 7 core pillars of urban sustainability and how those fed into the 17 global goals. And so that was the first step. And then we made this declaration to say we want to do a formal VLR last fall before the UN Climate Summit. And we're fortunate to be members of ICLEI, this international network of sustainability professionals and cities committed towards advancing sustainable development. And ICLEI approached the city of Orlando with an opportunity to develop a template for VLRs, to basically be their first effort at supporting a local government and going through all of the processes to outline a voluntary local review. Cale Roberts is our counterpart, our program manager for this, and he's been tremendous at supporting the city, double checking our matching exercises and helping us to prioritize what SDGs we want to focus on in this VLR. And those are going to be SDG 2, 3, 6, 7, 11, 12, 13, 15, and 17. So it's 9 of the 17. I know that's a good amount, but the purpose of it was to first start with the alignment with the core 7 priorities of the Greenworks plan, right? The mayor's priority for sustainable development at the local level, and try to make those linkages. Of course, it's been very difficult to engage people in person, and so that's certainly made it challenging. But Cale is continuing to interview certain key stakeholders throughout the city, whether it's our academic institutions, our local community foundation, different county and other governments, as well as the business and the nonprofit sector, to make sure that we're looking holistically at how the city of Orlando is addressing the SDGs. And so it's been quite an interesting process, and we hope that by this fall, we're going to have a published plan and be one of the first cities in America to come out with a formal VLR.
We'll talk a little bit about the reception that you've gotten from the private sector. And it'll also be good, I think, because I don't know that everybody knows, it'd be good for you to touch on what the local community foundation is doing as well around this.
Yeah, no doubt. So there's a couple of things there. One is, I realized that Orlando, we've been leading the charge in Central Florida and really across the state for advancing sustainable development. But it's not enough for our city to be a leader and for surrounding cities and counties to be laggards. The impact essentially will never be realized to the extent that we need it to. And one of the things that we've been doing was trying to work with our regional planning council to essentially establish a regional collaborative that looked at the SDGs as the core framework and that moved our region in a healthier, cleaner, and more sustainable direction. 2 years ago, the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council brought on Jennifer Rupert, who's our resilience officer for that institution. And that group, that Regional Planning Council, looks over 7 counties in the Central Florida area. We have, fast forward to last October, established an East Central Florida Regional Resilience Collaborative, now made up of over 30 government and academic institutions who have passed formal MOUs through their councils or board of county commissions and have committed to advancing the sustainable development goals under the people, planet, and prosperity, core triple bottom line. And that's been pretty instrumental even during COVID for city to city kind of peer-to-peer conversations and kind of brainstorming how to solve certain things during this time, especially in our region. So I think that there was some momentum there on the Regional Planning Council side, and then simultaneously our community foundation, what's known as the Central Florida Foundation, also started to get some interest around how the SDGs were accounted for in every dollar that they were giving to the community. And so they did a cursory look backwards at every penny that has been given out from the Central Florida Foundation historically and tied them to the SDGs. They actually did an alignment exercise for that, and then decided that moving forward, we needed to, more meaningfully incorporate the SDGs in the work that they were doing. And so Mark Brewer and Sandy Vidal and that whole team at Central Florida Foundation have launched now what's called Thrive Central Florida. And it's a new effort that has now lifted up 5 different impact funds for individuals and corporations to invest in that will be specific to advancing the sustainable development goals in different categories. And it's our first attempt at really trying to get the financial sector on board with, charting forward our sustainable development agenda.
So interestingly, and again, I'm going to refer to a question that's popped up in the chat as well. So you're in Florida. Florida is a very diverse state. has some very conservative parts of Florida. There's also more liberal, but it's what we would think of as a purple state. And one of the questions in the chat, and to your point about working regionally to get other governments, other municipalities on board with the sustainable development goals. There's a question here, you know, someone lives in a Republican-controlled local district. So what are your tips or suggestions for advancing the concept of sustainable development and using the goals and other tools like that with municipal governments on more conservative side? What's worked so far? What's been helpful in that conversation?
I think what's been helpful is speaking their language, and essentially trying to not necessarily transform the goals to be different, but more articulate how those goals are intersecting with the priorities of any given elected official or political stance. You know, obviously this notion around economic recovery and job creation is at the forefront of every single person's mind. And as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the trends of the fastest growing parts of our economy, it happens to be in the industries that are aligned with advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 7 around affordable and clean energy is one of the fastest growing industries that we're seeing. And so, you know, we've been successful in speaking across those party lines by really, you know, elevating that message. This is about jobs. This is about economic investment into our communities. This is about also enhancing quality of life and public health. And I think less about the environment being the core reason why we're doing things and saving us from the climate crisis, less about that conversation and more about brass tacks. What is it going to take to meaningfully recover economically and to put our families back with good, high-paying jobs, and at the same time improve public health? And this notion around COVID, you know, even in the sustainability world, has elevated the importance of health. Health has always been part of this agenda, but I believe now that health is the priority. It's about public health, environmental health, and economic health. And those three are interchangeable. They're so linked together that they're unable to be addressed if they're not addressed as one.
In some respects, it's like proof of concept of sustainable development, because sustainable development's looking at all of those dimensions at once and showing where the interdependencies are. And
precisely,
this particular crisis really demonstrates that and exposes that. But I also want to touch on, because in some respects, local governments and local leaders like Mayor Dyer and yourself are being faced with like multiple emergencies at once. You've got COVID, but then in the United States, you know, we've experienced the death of George Floyd and the protest and the growing consciousness around racial equity and criminal justice that's come with that. So talk a little bit about, because you're talking about how your mindset is on this recovery around job creation. How has that affected, how has that growing consciousness around racial equity affected your thinking about where you go from here, even with COVID and on the economic recovery, and also around issues of justice like that?
Yeah, there's a big movement now around intersectional environmentalism, and the fact of the matter is that we can no longer address the climate crisis and the environmental injustices that we see if we don't address the rooted racial inequities that this country, quite frankly, has been built upon. The fact of the matter is those that experience the worst impact during COVID are those that are least resourced and that have been burdened with these injustices for the longest. And I think that this is uncovering the importance of, as we look to recover, even in this green economy, how do we ensure that those that are being impacted and are least fortunate are the first to recover? And that is something that's in the front of our minds in a number of different ways. First and foremost, I think, as it relates to the notion around George Floyd and police brutality, our chief of police, Orlando Rolon, has done a pretty amazing job, quite frankly, when you look at chiefs across the country, at very quickly prioritizing how we respond as a police department and as a city to these issues found across the country. The 8 can't wait policies were immediately looked at, revised, and our internal policies and procedures were in lockstep and in line with the 8 can't wait policies. We've now approved all of them. We have instituted monthly equity workshops, and this was pre-COVID, but I had already started to work on race and equity as it involved sustainable development back when we launched this plan in 2018. We started a Foundations for Race and Equity training program that we borrowed from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN, and trained not only my staff, but staff in multicultural affairs, in the homelessness department, and others to start to ensure that we're doing this across the city. We also have a monthly equity workshop where we look at any given policy or program, and we utilize this equity lens that has been developed by GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And this lens really has you ask yourself some tough but very important questions about the intention of what you're trying to bring about, and ensuring that you don't unintendedly, create consequences for others without even knowing it. And so this has become a standard practice. But that's not enough. Obviously, that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how we're going to begin to address these structural and institutional racism and inequities. And I truly believe that there are things that we can do. Right now, one of the other inequities that we've identified is the energy burden within households. You don't realize that often the second highest cost to live is our cost of utilities. And we've done a mapping exercise, an equity mapping exercise, to look at electric, water, gas, transportation, and food insecurity across each neighborhood, down to the neighborhood parcel, to begin identifying where are these inequities within our city. So we've mapped them. And in addition, we found out that certain households in different parts of our city, those that are low and moderate income, were spending 3 to 4 times as much on their monthly utility bill as an affluent community. 3 to 4 times as much per square foot. It's unbelievable. And often these individuals are renters, so they don't have the control over the building assets that are more efficient. And so you have this landlord-tenant complex. How did we go about addressing that? We have 2 programs that I think are really important to end off on. One is, it's called Efficiency Delivered. It's offered by our utility, and it's a free home energy assessment and up to $2,000 of funding to make weatherization and efficiency improvements, of which we subsidize based on household income. So if you're under a $40,000 per month or per month household income, or per year household income, shall I say, we cover 85% of that $2,000 contribution. We cover $1,700, they pay $300 incrementally on the utility bill over a 12-month period at no interest. So it's an on-bill, we've leveraged the utility bill as a financing mechanism to help individuals repay for these improvements, and of course finding savings greater than that monthly allotment, right? And then secondly is partnered with a nonprofit called SELF, which is a nonprofit clean energy lender that targets low and moderate income communities. This SELF fund can be used for energy efficiency, renewables, water efficiency, even disability improvements to their home, and hurricane protection, resilience improvements for your household. And this is targeting low and moderate income census tracts. They're a CDFI, and the majority of their money has to go to those areas. So we've been trying to lift up financial programs that, again, offset the upfront burden to make these improvements and creatively repay either on a utility bill or through low interest loans that really have cash flow scenarios.
So that's a whole nice trajectory right there, because you talked about like internal tools and policies that you were using, sort of internal operationally, looking through the lens on a regular basis around your policies and doing the mapping that you talked about. That can lead to innovation, and the way in which you were discussing the sharing of funds, and then also new partnerships and governance with a local nonprofit. So I wanted to, we're running short on time, but I want to continue to integrate some of what we're hearing in the chat. And one of this would be great. I mean, there's a question as, so access to education is obviously a big issue now in the COVID era. We're talking about how students are having to do distance learning, obviously a big part of the global goals. yet it's not part, it's not one of the goals that you mentioned as part of your VLR.
Correct.
So why not? Like, what was the decision making around that? And how are you thinking about consideration around education as it relates to sustainable development and also your recovery from COVID-19?
Education is so critical. It's the foundation for anybody's prosperity at the end of the day. And something that's important to note, and the reason why we didn't include it, is that the county, very similar to how they control the health department, they control the public school system. So we don't have any say operationally, policy-wise, or the like in influencing our local public school system. That has not held me back from engaging our public school system to begin integrating the SDGs and other sustainability components into their efforts. Just earlier this year, right before COVID hit, we worked with a nonprofit called Eco Heroes Show, and they go around across the country and they bring students into a cafeteria or a gymnasium, and they do these art and song and dance around the environment to get people, and kids primarily, excited about being good stewards. And so we've funded programs like that. I sit on the Green School Recognition Board for the public school system to support schools in incorporating everything from food waste collection to on-site gardens to energy efficiency retrofits for the schools. So we are engaged, but we felt in this first VLR that we really wanted to focus on the topics that we as a city can control and that were aligned with the priorities that Mayor Dyer and our city administration and commissioners have outlined as our priorities for Orlando in moving in a sustainable direction. So that'll be
it's a great example, though, of cities feeling as if that the entire range of SDGs are really meaningful for their city's lives, but that they have constraints on their jurisdiction and managerial control on portions of those. So it really is sort of a multiple level governance. And even back to your earlier conversation about the regional economic resilience, how important that is. So let's just end, we're a couple minutes over, but let's just end with one final question, because my question is then to you, how important are the collective voice of cities to be involved in these sort of policy conversations as it relates to not only COVID, but sustainable development, even at the global level? And what's your take on that? How do you, through your perch at Orlando, try to be engaging with other cities, and how important is it for a city's voice to be part of these kinds of deliberations?
I'll tell you from our experience, the peer-to-peer networks that we're a part of have been instrumental in accelerating Orlando's journey towards sustainable development. We're part of international, national, regional, and local networks of cities and counties. Everything from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, we talked about ICLEI, the Global Covenant of Mayors, the Brookings SDG Leadership Cities Alliance, and this Regional Resilience Collaborative. Those are just a handful of examples. And what's interesting is each one of these has their own strengths and are helping cities dive into the weeds around how to get around policy barriers or develop innovative programming to address certain aspects. A lot of them are talking about race and equity, which I greatly appreciate. And in terms of the collective force of cities, just yesterday we finished signing a sign-on letter of climate mayors across the country, right now 170 and growing, that is going to be sent to Congress and our president, really underscoring the importance of a green economic recovery as we look towards the next round of stimulus funding that may be coming out of Congress. This is critical, again, as we talked about, from a job creation, from a local investment standpoint, and from a public health standpoint, let alone addressing the climate crisis and environmental issues. And so we definitely see the importance of these types of networks coming together, flexing our voices, and as one unit, trying to influence policy at a national or even international level. So they're critical, and greatly appreciate the work that you, Tony, and the Brookings team have been doing to bring our cities, international cities together to talk about localizing the SDGs and what we can do to work through that challenge. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us today. This has been a really rich and wide-ranging discussion. Orlando has been a model in many different dimensions on sustainable development. So kudos to you and to Mayor Dyer and the team there. All best wishes as you steer and navigate your way through the COVID crisis, and also what it means for sort of the future of Orlando, and as you sort of remodel and reshape the economy and what needs to happen going forward. Thanks very much. Thanks for all of you for joining us on this edition. We'll have, I'll be hosting Mayor Marvin Rees of Bristol, UK next week. So please join us. And we've added a live feed on our Twitter account at Brookings Global for these transmissions. So find us there or find us here through Zoom. And until the next time, thanks very much.